right to submit my report. In the 10th month of the 26th year of the Guangxu Emperor, the British traveler Aurel Stein entered my district and searched for antiquities. Over a period of about 20 days, he found the remains of walls and ruined temples, all buried beneath the sand in an area bereft of human habitation. When I met with him later, he showed me a collection of clay Buddhist figurines, wooden tablets, fragments of folded leather strips, and many pages of tattered wastepaper with writing on them. They all appear to be ancient Buddhist writings in an Indian script. Because the sands out there are high and the ground dry, the ink is still bright and the objects show few signs of decay. When I asked this traveler whether or not he could read these documents, he said that he could read most of it, and that they contained orders from ancient kings to their officials and the exchange of letters among travelers going to and from India. As to the orders I have received from the governor to make a copy of these documents, I confess that as I cannot make out the style of handwriting used on them, any attempt to trace a copy by hand would be futile. Signed, Pan Jun, Magistrate of Khotan District. Far out along the northern and western frontiers of the Qing Empire, Chinese officials exercised a loose authority over the lands of Tibet, Xinjiang, and Mongolia. Tibet, with its vast frozen plateaus and enormous stretches of uninhabited land, offered little of interest for the hunter of antiquities. Mongolia, with its rich history of powerful nomadic confederations and recurrent interactions with the fertile agricultural lands of the south, was of slightly more interest, but still lacked dense concentrations of the sort of classically designed art and antiquities most coveted by collectors. The same, however, could not be said of Xinjiang. Often referred to as the crossroads of Eurasia, Xinjiang, or Chinese Turkestan, served as the backdrop for a diverse assortment of invading armies and wandering migrants over the past several thousand years. During the height of the Silk Road, Buddhism came from India, Manichaeism from Persia, and Islam from the Middle East. At the same time, migrants came from India, China, and Central Asia. Above them all stood a revolving door of invading armies, including at one time or another the Tibetans, Mongols, Uyghurs, Chinese, and Uzbeks. By the end of the 19th century, Chinese, Manchu, and Mongol officials of the Qing dynasty had already ruled over Xinjiang for more than 100 years. They were soon joined by the Russians and British, whose vast empires increasingly encroached on the region. The Russians from their outposts in Central Asia, the British from their base in India. It was thus only a matter of time before Russian and British diplomats each managed to secure permission from the emperor in Beijing for the establishment of dueling consulates in the sprawling oasis of Kashgar. By the last decade of the 19th century, two men jealously guarded their respective interests, Nikolai Petrovsky for the Russians and George Macartney for the British. The oasis dwellers of Xinjiang, having long tilled their fields along the fringes of the Taklamakan Desert with the aid of melted alpine snow, had likely been stumbling upon the remains of ancient Buddhist kingdoms for hundreds, perhaps even 1,000 years. But it was only with the arrival of Macartney and Petrovsky in Kashgar that they began to realize such things could yield a material profit. For Macartney and Petrovsky saw in these artifacts something no one else in Xinjiang had yet been able to see: themselves. Much like Lord Elgin in Athens and Heinrich Schliemann in Troy, the Russian and British consuls of Kashgar had a penchant for detecting the greatness of Western civilization in even the remotest corners of the world. In this case, the inspiration came from Alexander the Great. In the 4th century BC, this young Macedonian king embarked on more than a decade of unprecedented military conquest throughout the lands of Anatolia, Persia, and what are today the lands of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Everywhere Alexander's armies went, they left their mark on local populations by mixing their language, culture, and customs with those of their newly acquired subjects. More than 2,000 years later, Europeans returned to the same lands once settled by Alexander's armies. There they found traces of what they called Gandharan art, a mix of Asian and Greek motifs, styles, and craftsmanship often expressed through a Buddhist medium. Of course, only the Greek elements of such works were singled out for praise. The German archaeologist Albert von Lecoq, in attempting to describe one such sculpture, observed how, quote, "the drapery falls in noble lines, not yet degraded by Eastern Asiatic misunderstanding of classical forms." Degraded or not, only tantalizing fragments of Gandharan art survived in Central and South Asia, much of it having been destroyed or repurposed at the hands of Hindu and Muslim successors. In Xinjiang, however, the shifting sands of the Taklamakan Desert managed to preserve abandoned towns and military outposts for over 1,000 years, far from the reach of civilization. Petrovsky and McCartney were some of the first to spot what looked like traces of Buddhist and Gandharan art on the shelves of local curio shops and in the homes of known treasure seekers. They also noticed strange forms of writing preserved on wood tablets and birch leaf manuscripts, a few of which later proved to record various Indo-European languages and scripts, some previously unknown. These they bought and shipped to scholars in Europe. That in turn initiated a predictable reaction. The scholars, already inclined to see themselves in anything bearing traces of Greek art, were now eager to recover art and antiquities that might shed light on the triumphal march of Western civilization into Asia. The first Westerner to brave the desert sands of Xinjiang was the brash Swedish explorer Sven Hedin. In the 1890s, Hedin twice proved the feasibility of venturing into the Taklamakan Desert for weeks at a time, a necessary benchmark for any prolonged excavation of a buried oasis. In 1900, the Hungarian-turned-British scholar Aurel Stein followed in Hedin's footsteps. Unlike Hedin, however, Stein came ready to dig. Over the course of 3 separate expeditions spanning the next 15 years, Stein would fill the basement of the British Museum to the brim with Gandharan art and antiquities. He also brought back tens of thousands of ancient manuscripts written in numerous scripts and languages, some long dead and forgotten. Other explorers followed. Today, the art, antiquities, and manuscripts of northwestern China can be found all over the world, from St. Petersburg to New Delhi to Tokyo. The Silk Road expeditions constituted the first mass exodus of art and antiquities from China to occur outside of a military looting operation. Their success was predicated on the fact that they went in search of Indian Buddhist artifacts buried on the fringes of Muslim communities. In other words, the stuff that left the country was, much as in Egypt, marked by a perception of cultural discontinuity with the present-day inhabitants of the land, who were generally content to earn a commission on its removal. It did not take long, however, for men like Hedin and Stein to stumble upon ancient Chinese antiquities and scripts as well, along with Buddhist sutras written in Chinese. This presented an awkward scenario, for unlike their Muslim subjects, the Chinese officials posted to Xinjiang most definitely identified with anything written in Chinese or evocative of their own Buddhist traditions. Han Zhen, the magistrate of Khotan whose report began this episode, may not have been able to read the Buddhist materials in Sanskrit, but he could certainly read those written in Chinese, and he was eager to obtain his own copies. There was just one problem. The Chinese officials in Xinjiang were officials, not explorers. In other words, they had a job to do, and it was a demanding one. As a result, they were not at liberty to venture out into the desert for weeks at a time, nor were they interested in doing so. In 1902, one Chinese official observed of his colleagues that upon, quote, seeing Mr. Stein crossing mountains and rivers, or traveling through the desert, they laugh at his folly. Zhu Reicher, the prefect of Guma County, was less dismissive, but remained appalled at the hardships the men like Stein had endured, such as losing a toe to frostbite. While on the road, Zhu wrote to Stein in 1908, you encountered snow-capped mountain peaks and a bitter cold air that pierced through to the bone and rendered all clothing immaterial. What I mourn is the thought of the hardships you must endure while scaling mountains and fording bodies of water, and of the difficult straits in which you continually place yourself. What I admire, however, is your stern fortitude and valiant resolve. At the dawn of the 20th century, the Confucian gentlemen did not yet celebrate the virtues of manual labor, but still they clamored to get their hands on the Chinese treasures of the Silk Road. Expeditions they could not and would not do, but excavations were within the realm of the possible, so long as they could oversee the work from the confines of their government office. In this capacity, the Chinese officials of Xinjiang most closely resembled Lord Elgin, who, it might be recalled, orchestrated the removal of the Parthenon marbles entirely from the comfort of his embassy in Constantinople. In Xinjiang, such an arrangement was replicated most closely in the vicinity of the oasis of Turfan. There, as Stein observed, the ruins are practically all within village areas and within reach of pleasant quarters. This meant that systematic digs spanning many weeks could be funded, managed, and exploited from the convenience of urban residences. Though most Western explorers liked to give the impression that the Chinese were largely indifferent to their excavations, it is clear that they too were determined to get their share. As Stein noted in his field diary on several separate occasions, the Astana graves at Turfan had been worked by a man named Muhammad Jiza, quote, for supplying Chinese at Turfan and Urumqi. Eager to portray his own excavations in a more positive light than those done on behalf of the Chinese, Stein went on to characterize those of the Chinese as constituting, quote, unchecked destruction in which the local people and the officials employing them have been allowed to indulge. Prior to the 1911 revolution, the scorecard between Chinese and Western collectors in China was relatively balanced. In the Chinese heartland, everyone got their share of oracle bones and freshly excavated tombs, but the Chinese clearly got the most, and even managed to retain a near-complete monopoly on the domestic art market. Conversely, out in Xinjiang, everybody also got his share of Silk Road treasures, but this time it was the Westerners who left the Chinese in the dust. In the end, it would fall to a dusty frontier oasis town to tip the scales decisively in favor of the foreigners. Please join us next time as we explore the Guardians of Dunhuang in episode 15 of Indiana Jones in History.